Reactive Training Systems.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the RTS podcast. I'm here today with Ross Leppala. Ross is the newest coach for RTS, the newest assistant coach that we've got on our staff. He's been working with athletes for a while. He's been working with us for a long time, and just through the process, we needed some more coaching capability, and Ross definitely had it. So we brought him on board, and part of the reason that we're having him on today is to just talk a little bit, because I know that a lot of people out there don't know you, and they probably should. So Ross, as a way to kind of get things rolling, can you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you come into powerlifting, stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. I first found the weight room back when I was in junior high school for track and football, like a lot of people. And then around ninth grade, there was a local bench press meet just north of the town I was in, and my football coach at the time encouraged me to go do it, and I went and checked it out, and almost bombed, as a lot of people do on their first meet. Almost had a really bad experience, but fortunately, because the people at the meet and the community that was there and the support that was there helped pick me up, and I ended up making at least one of my 3 benches and got hooked ever since, and started doing that meet every year, and did a couple other meets in Minnesota. And unfortunately, through college and when I first moved up here to Alaska, I kind of had a little bit of hiatus, so I didn't really, lifting wasn't as serious, and I wasn't really competing again until about 2011. And now it's been full go, 3 to 4 meets every year, Raw Nationals every year, now Arnold every year.
Yeah, I would say it's been kind of a big part of your life since then, eh?
Yeah, huge part of my life. Part of my life, for sure.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you originally played football back in Minnesota. Did you ever get into coaching football, or did you coach any other sports besides powerlifting, or did you pretty much just kind of jump right into this?
Well, so I always had a big appeal to wanting to coach football, because my high school coach, Bruddy, was quite the significant mentor in my life. He had a pretty profound impact on who I am and how I became the person that I am today. But once I got to a point where I could start looking at coaching football, I decided that I didn't like the interference that booster clubs create in sports, in high school sports, and I decided that would drive me nuts and it wouldn't make me happy. But I did do some snowboard instructing that was a lot like coaching and teaching a lot of people. That was quite a good experience.
Snowboard instructing, huh? Like, how are you?
I'm sorry, Mike, you froze on that question. I didn't hear you.
I said, how serious of a snowboarder are you?
I get pretty serious. I mean, that was one of the big reasons why I moved to Alaska, was so I could have longer winters and more snow access and big mountains.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it's huge. It calms my mind more than anything else I've ever done. I can actually stop thinking about life and just ride down the mountain.
Cool. I haven't got really into snowboarding. When I lived here in Colorado the first time, I've been snowboarding a handful of times, but barely to beginner level, I would say. But
Right.
I'd like to do that more. So maybe if you do end up moving down to Colorado, and we'll go up on the mountains. You can. So to kind of bring it back toward coaching a little bit. So how long have you been specifically coaching for powerlifting then?
Specifically for powerlifting, I suppose it would be little over 3 years now.
Mm-hmm.
I always helped out people in the gym and tried to do what I could there with people and did it for free. And then I started learning how to program and doing stuff like that. And that's when I decided, well, I'm kind of doing pretty good at this, and it's taken up some time. I should maybe just start a business. And and roll with it. So I started engineered athletics and started taking on clients, and started that in about towards the end of 2013, beginning of 2014.
Yeah. And the name
So
engineered athletics is kind of telling as well. Because you're an engineer by trade, right?
yeah, yeah. So I
Yeah,
tend to
so
look at go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I tend to look at a lot of it in the same manner as structural engineering, as far as you have a load on the body and on the system, and you have to create force production and load transfer at the same time. And that's, everything in structural engineering is all about a applied force and that load transfer, and you have to find out your line of force and transfer it to the ground. So
So would you say that that mostly informs your views on like technical execution, or does it go beyond that?
yeah, it definitely plays into it. There's definitely obviously a lot of differences, and because most structures don't have moving parts like the body does. So that definitely makes it a lot more dynamic, as we would call it in the engineering world. Um, but it definitely helps, I think, um, because a lot of the same things that you would not find optimal in a structure are the same things that you would not find optimal in in your body as it moves through space. You don't want to have a lot of your lines. You want to have straight and perpendicular 90-degree angles, things like that. You don't want to see a member flexing under load, like you don't want to see your spine flexing under load. You want to keep it straight, flat, and rigid throughout a squat and a deadlift.
Sure. Sure.
Um, and then, but if it's kind of like in a rounded back deadlift, if it starts out rounded and a member in a structure starts out rounded, well, then it was done so with purpose. So it's, while there's still obviously that inherent risk with rounded back deadlifting, it's less risky if it starts out rounded than if it just gets rounded because of the load.
Yeah, so you're talking about at a minimum keeping that position stable rather than flexing under load. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense, and that's kind of a similar position that I've taken on round back deadlifting in particular in the past as well. Just like if that's how you deadlift the most weight and you understand the risks associated with it, you're willing to accept those risks, then do it within these limitations, and that would be one of them, making sure that you're not flexing under load. But if you're not aware of the risks, or you're not able to, uh, keep it within, those limits of kind of acceptability, then you should really transition away from it. Like, I feel that that's too much risk for a person to reasonably assume at that point. Um,
Agreed.
and beyond that, it's probably counterproductive as well. If you are flexing under load into, from a flat to a rounded position, then, why not just assume that rounded position in the beginning, or train the flat position to be strong enough, stable enough to be maintained under the load.
Yeah. If only I could do that.
Well, yeah, I mean, easier said than done. And, and that brings up a pretty significant problem, I think, with round back deadlifting in particular, is that if you have somebody who's just naturally a round back deadlifter and they say, you know what, I don't want to assume these risks. I would like to deadlift more safely. So I'm going to try to transition into a flatter back position. I mean, that's good. And that's obviously where you would have to be to get started, but it's not really sufficient by itself. Like, making that transition from a round back puller to a flat back puller is not an easy one to make. And even if you tend to be more of a natural flat back deadlifter like I am, um, it's still not easy to maintain. When the load gets sufficiently heavy, that's a potential failure point, is just the ability to maintain that position under load. And so if you're naturally a round back deadlifter and you're trying to make that transition, it's easy enough with light weights. You can lighten the weight enough so that I think most anyone with a little bit of technical instruction can figure it out. The problem is with heavy weights. Like
Yeah.
who wants to lift light weights?
Yeah, exactly.
So I would assume that you and I are pretty well aligned on that, but I'll ask the question anyway. What have you found to be effective for coaching someone through that transition, like from a round back to a flat back?
Um, movement wise, the biggest movement wise, I think that helps with that is a combination of 2 count pause deadlifts and nightmare deadlifts, where you start at the floor and you pull to your knee, bring it back to the floor, pull to your knee, bring it back to the floor, and then do full range of motion. I think it really helps reinforce that starting position, because I think oftentimes you're going to round your back, and if you round your back as the bar breaks the floor, a lot of times it's mostly going to be an inefficient starting position and just not generating the tension that
I
it
see.
takes to keep it flat.
Now,
So
the before you go on, the nightmare deadlift is probably a thing that bears maybe a little bit more explanation. So, like what you're describing is a deadlift where the bar starts on the floor and you pull it to the knee, you pause, you lower it back to the floor, pull it to the knee, pause, back to the floor, and then a full rep. Um, and that would be one repetition, right?
correct.
So it's very similar to like a 1.5 squat where you kind of squat to the bottom, come halfway up, go to the bottom again, and then come all the way up. Except there's 2 half reps in the beginning.
Right.
Yeah.
The only change to that is there isn't really necessarily a designated pause at the knee. It's just to the
Okay.
knee and then down. But I
Okay.
suppose you could make it a really shitty nightmare and include that pause in there.
How bad of a nightmare do you want, right?
Right? Exactly. Exactly. Do you want Jason or do you want Freddy Krueger? Which one scares you
Right.
more?
Well, I kind of interrupted your thought, I think, regarding uh, transitioning over to a flat back deadlift. You were saying that you would include pause deadlifts and these nightmare deadlifts. In what capacity would you include these different movements? Like, how would you go about setting that up?
Generally, those are going to be done with a bit lower rep, higher intensity. Um, I suppose one could do higher rep 2 count pause deadlifts, but I don't really think you get that much out of it, because you start reducing the load too much, and that's going to be where you really want to try and start addressing that, is because, like you said too, I mean, obviously a strong person can overcome that inefficiency at a lighter weight with relative ease. So you're trying to progress that positional change under a higher load. And 10 reps, you're going to be at a significantly reduced load if you're, as compared to doing 3 to 4 reps.
Yeah,
And
another way
same
to
thing with nightmare deadlifts. There's already a lot of work being done there with essentially 2 reps for 1 rep with the half reps in the beginning.
well,
You
another way
start
to
getting
think
real
of it,
tired.
another way to think of it, I think, is kind of a time under tension idea. So if you pull a regular deadlift, that rep might take 1 second. It might take 2 or 3 seconds if it's a slower rep. Um, and of course, we all know those people that'll grind out a max effort pull that for 10 seconds or something, but that's not really what we're referring to. So let's take a 2 or 3 second rep, which is not a particularly fast rep. Now, if you're going to do a 2 count pause deadlift, so now you've got a 2 second pause, and plus, let's say the concentric portion is only 1 second. Well, now that's a 3 second rep, which is the equivalent time under tension to something that's pretty grindy. Whether it's actually grindy or not, you still have a metabolic demand from that time under tension, and then if you multiply that by 10, do a set of 10 with it, then I mean, yeah, the weight, it's exactly what you're saying. The weight that you have to use is so light at that point that it almost negates the usefulness of the movement. The idea is The idea behind the pause is to have a sufficient load on the bar so that that pause generates an isometric training effect. And if you're doing 10 reps, then the load on the bar is going to be so small. Yeah, you get a long time under tension, but it's not a very high quality tension. And I tend to agree with you. What you need at that point is the higher tension that you get from heavier weights. Now, it doesn't have to be heavy singles, but let's say in the 1 to 4 rep range, I tend not to like to do pause work for more than 4 reps because I feel like you're kind of crossing that line that you're talking about. And it's going to be a similar line of thinking behind the nightmare work. It's just a name for the lift, but behind the nightmare deadlifts, it's similar reasoning.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever personally done more than 4 reps for a nightmare deadlift, and really getting towards the end of that 4th rep, it's pretty brutal, and there's a fairly significant load reduction if you want to compare it to like your regular competition exercise. You're probably down in the 60% of that load, that range.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, it would be similar then to what you're going to use for, say, a straight leg deadlift for higher repetitions, 10 or 12 or something like that.
Yeah.
All right. I wanted to ask you, kind of piggybacking on the engineered athletics thing, and now we're talking about applications for that. Do you feel like you have a specialty as a coach, an area that you like to focus in? I mean, obviously powerlifting, but within that audience.
One of the things I tend to think about a question like that is, I think a lot of the technical stuff as far as learning how to teach people a movement and learning how to do a program are all things that almost anybody can learn how to do and do at least a decent job at. So I tend to think that my stronger points at coaching are a bit more characteristic in nature than it is those technical aspects in nature. And I tend to place a pretty big emphasis on just being generally supportive to the athlete and remembering that they're people and treating them as such and working with them, the person, and not just them, the athlete, and understanding that they're not just a machine that you can just sit there and keep giving a repetitive load after load after load after load, and they just keep getting better and better. There's going to be days where they kind of need to lean on you mentally when they have a bad day or something like that. And I think that's one of my favorite aspects to coaching, because that's one of the things that I really enjoyed about some of the other coaches that I've had that have been influential. Like I mentioned, Bruddy in football, he was taught us a lot more than just the game of football.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. That's a huge component of coaching.
So, and sometimes that means being as supportive as far as not necessarily being in that coaching role for them anymore. Robin Johnson coached her in the 2015 IPF World Championships, and she ended up winning the sub-junior 72 kilogram division. And on the plane ride back from Finland, I was sitting there writing up her program for the next week, and I was trying to get some stuff out of her and see what kind of direction she wanted to go with it. And I could see she was a little nervous, and I shut the computer. I'm like, just spit it out. What's going on? Long story short, she wanted to change her focus away from powerlifting, and she was really scared to tell me that. I'm like, no, dude, you got to go do it. You're 15 going on 16 years old. Life's all about experience. You got to go out there and experience and find out what you really enjoy and what you really love to do, and do more of that.
Yeah.
So
how many of us, I mean, with the rare exception, I suppose I would be one of the exceptions, but there's not a lot of people, I think, that, latch on to a hobby at 15 or 16 years old and then maintain that for, 20, 30 plus years, going, basically for the rest of their adult life into getting into older age even, so it's not a big deal to walk away from things for a little bit and then come back to it. And I think it's funny, like if you talk to a lot of veteran lifters, who have been doing this for like literally decades, a lot of them have, a year, a couple years, even more than that, of a break somewhere in there, where they walked away from the sport when they had a young family, or they just kind of got bored with it and wanted to go work on cars for a while,
Yeah.
anything like that, and I don't think it's a bad thing. And I'm starting to think that it's not even a huge hindrance toward your athletic development. On one hand, I mean, it's nice to have a long training history and that quality of information to draw from. But in terms of like a long-term development plan, I mean, I don't see that as being it's at minimum not an insurmountable obstacle. And it might even be beneficial in some way that I can't quite articulate yet, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, and she's still killing it out there. She's doing some Olympic weightlifting and CrossFit stuff, and she's an incredibly gifted, talented athlete, and I think she can have success in any avenue that she goes, especially with her work ethic.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And, kind of, I know some powerlifters. It just kind of speaks to the difference, broad differences in mentality. I think um, I know some powerlifters or people that compete in powerlifting um, who don't really want to pigeonhole themselves into powerlifting. Who like they look up to guys like Bill Kazmaier, who had kind of a reputation for um, taken on any sort of strength challenge, like I'll go here and do strongman or Highland Games or powerlifting or weightlifting or anything, if it's related to strength in some way, then I'll take that challenge, and so they like that approach to their strength training experience, in a more broad sense. So they don't really focus hard on powerlifting and maximizing the squat, bench, and deadlift because they have a broader focus than that, and it's more personal. And do you suffer? Like, does your powerlifting total suffer for that? Yeah, probably. At least in the long term, most likely. But if that's where your interest lies, I
right.
mean,
I
so
think
be it.
exactly. I mean, if that keeps up here healthy, then that's probably more important at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I mean that's cool in its own way, right? Like, I mean, don't get me wrong, going and winning an IPF championship is super cool. It's the
Yeah.
coolest meet that you can win, I think, Um, but there is something else cool about, just being generally skilled in that way, to be a pretty darn good powerlifter, to be a pretty darn good strongman, and do a lot of these different things. Now, of course, you get some people who take the idea of being a generalist to its extreme, and I mean, okay, neat, but that's not so much my preference. But I do lately, especially, I've started to see the attraction in just kind of doing some other weird stuff that's maybe off the beaten track a little bit.
Right.
Anyway,
Yeah.
there's a bit of a tangent, I guess, but
Well,
um,
I think a lot of times that having some of that diversity can almost renew your energy and your efforts for your main sport of choice, so to speak. I mean, having some, everybody always, I guess, over talks about having balance and all that stuff, and it seems like that can be a fairly hot topic these days. But I mean, I know for me, getting out on my snowboard with how I ride, it always takes away from my training week because I ride pretty hard, and a lot of times I'll hike some big mountains, and that takes a lot of effort and a lot of work, and my legs will be sore and tired. So the next couple of days after that for training is kind of taken away from that. But man, keep my mind right, then it's going to suck anyway.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So
That there's maybe some bigger picture stuff going on than the immediate training concerns.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So you use the magic word balance. Um, what do you see, or how do you go about maintaining a balance, specifically like with your own training and competing and coaching, but it can also be the rest of the interesting parts of life as well.
Well, I mean, the first thing is just making sure that you don't take on more than you can handle.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, right.
you know, which I mean, that can be always a tricky part to find, because a lot of
Yeah,
times you find that by falling off the backside of that, and you can't foresee it coming until the next thing you know, and you're swamped and you're staying up till midnight writing programs, and you got to wake up at 6 for work the next day. It's like, oh shit, what did I do?
yeah, yeah,
Um, but I think as far as managing it with the people that you're actually working with, is just making sure that they know that there's some boundaries in the system set in place. One of the things that I tell everybody, like, hey, I'll love to come meet day coach you, because that's, I don't know that there's a more fun time to coach than actually at the meet. But if I'm lifting, I'm not going to be coaching. And if I'm lifting the day after on a multiple day meet, I'm not going to be coaching. And if I can't get there, I'm not going to be coaching, because especially up here in Alaska, we have, meet venues that are 6 to 8 hours away from each other, driving all the way up to Fairbanks or down to the peninsula. And as much as I like to go to those, I'm not always going to be able to go, because that's, pretty much a 3-day weekend for me at that rate. So just being upfront with them and letting them know that, this is what I can do, this is what I can't do. This is what I'm going to try to do, but I can't promise.
yeah. One of the interesting things, I know you and I have discussed this a little bit already, but one of the interesting things that came out of Project Momentum this year um, is that the people who did better, let's say top 5% performers, enjoy the overall process more than your bottom 5% performers. Now, I mean, on its face, it's like, well, duh. I mean, if you're training, you're getting stronger, that's going to be fun. If you're training and it's going the wrong direction, that's not fun. And so there's that. And I'm not saying that training enjoyment is a causal factor in the overall results that you get from it. But I do think it's beneficial. I think it's beneficial from a recovery standpoint, probably more than anything else. So I guess my claim, and I've got precious little to back this up with at this point in time, but my current thinking is that training in a way that you enjoy the training process doesn't necessarily mean that that's what makes you stronger, but I do think it helps with the overall recovery process. And if you're well recovered, then you're generally getting more benefits from the training. You're seeing better training effects. So,
Yeah, for sure.
um, kind of from that angle, I think it's important to include other things in your life, things that are not related to lifting weights. Like you mentioned snowboarding, but it could be literally anything, but something that when you get done with it, you feel better, you feel energized, you feel positive, and when it's time to go back and go lift weights, that you're ready to do that, and that's one reason why I tend to shy away from writing training programs that are, 6 days a week or 7 days a week. Like somebody tells me I want to train 6 days a week or I want to train 7 days a week. And I
No, you
go,
don't.
oh man, you think you do, and that's because at whatever stage they're in, training is a positive influence on your life. But I mean, if you take anything to that extreme, I think that chances of it having a negative impact are greatly increased, and you've
Yeah,
got to balance it,
you have a bad week, and it's all 7 days of that week in training, and you're beat down and beat up. There's virtually no way that that's not going to carry over into the next week for a significant amount of time. You're going to kind of need that weekend to take a break and just recover and recharge.
Yeah, I mean, and there's definitely the physical component to it, but I think you can, and as you know, like I think you can program around the physical recovery component, but I don't know how you get around the mental recovery component. You know, just this, you're in the weight room in the same place, uh, probably with the same couple people or fewer, maybe by yourself, for however long. Probably it's even if you do the bare minimum amount of training, it's a significant portion of time, you
Right.
know, and that wears on you. That kind of degrades things over time. So I do think that you know, finding a way to compress that training into 4, even 5 days of training per week is going to be a better overall effect, just because it allows you to get out, get away from things a little bit. Even professionals, you know, and we can speak specifically about pro weightlifters, you know, former, you know, stories that come from the former Soviet Union and things like that. Take time away from the training hall. You know, you. It's a thing that, yeah, forgive me for kind of belaboring this point, but I think it's you know, maybe a big deal, but I felt that way, you know, when I was beginning in weightlifting, in lifting weights. Um, you know, this draw toward more and more training, you know, and I like lifting weights. I like how it makes me feel. I like the effects. Turns out I'm pretty good at it, and so I want to do more of it, you know. Okay, well that's great, but um, more of it doesn't always mean that you get more results from it, obviously, but it
Right.
also means that you wear that thing out a lot faster. And if you're going to do this for a long period of time, which if you want to be any good at it, you're going to have to do it for a long period of time, then you need to kind of save some of that, you know, and take up some additional hobbies. I know Andy Askow plays the guitar, and Ross snowboards, and
Right.
you know, I mean, people have other things going on in their lives, you know. For a lot of people past, you know, past a certain point, you know, they have families and things like that to occupy large portions of their time, which is
Oh
a bit
yeah.
different. But yeah, you know, it's all things that need to be addressed and taken care of, and I think that's maybe the key about finding that balance. You know, in the short term, it's recovery and getting the maximum benefit from your training, but in the long term, it's longevity and sustainability. Kind of
Yeah.
long way around of making that point, but there it is.
Well, right, but but it is important. I think a lot of people can find value in that. One of the things that I recently did for me to help with some of my mental game is because a lot of times training alone and me being totally type A engineer analytical kind of person, sometimes I forget to have fun when I lift. And I LS McLean put out a video on YouTube a while back about talking why he lifts and because he has fun. And I'm like, you're right, man. Like I totally I'm totally losing some of this on some days and I need to not. So I made a goofy little poster with just some colorful letters on it that just says have fun, and I put it on the wall in my gym so I can see it every day as that little reminder every day. I mean, and it wouldn't have to be something like that. It could be anything, you know. I put a bunch of pictures of people that I've coached with and lifted with over the years around it so that there's also fun memories going on with it. And you know, so a lot of times, especially if I know I'm going in and there's some crappy work to be done on that day, I'll kind of stop for a minute and just look at the wall, and changes my attitude. Instead of being focused on, oh man, you know, for example, a by 6 at 9 for me is it's hard, it's brutal, and it really hits me. And I'll kind of go into the day like, oh man, I got to do this today. This is gonna suck. And then I'll get in there and look at that stuff and be like, shut up, dude. Have fun. Let's have fun. Like And I think a lot of it can be the recognition that you have a choice too, you can choose your attitude about how you approach something.
Yeah, yeah. And I do get that people, people have different motivations, and they're bringing their own personality to this, and things like that.
Definitely.
But um, I think you see that component with a wide range of personalities, though. Just the the need to get some sort of enjoyment out of it. It doesn't. I tell people sometimes that for me personally, I wouldn't use the word fun in my own training, but it is satisfying on some level. Like fun to me is to go do something that's purely for its own entertainment, or that has like that immediate gratification sort of feel to it. But
Right.
and to me, training is like this investment into a more long-term realization, and it's definitely satisfying on some level, but there needs to be a fun component to it. And I think for a lot of people, that's training partners. You get some social interaction, especially if you're around a group of people that you like, that can be fun. And that's one thing that, I've neglected in the past with my training. But, I've definitely brought it back in, and I'm making more of an effort to include that now, and I think it's, in terms of balance and stability and things like that, I think it's a much better approach.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that, being a home gym guy myself. Um, and I think about it all the time. Well, not all the time, but I think about it frequently, like once a month, every other month and a half or so. I always think to myself, oh man, like I really need to go into the gym and just get a session in at the gym, and I need to maybe try and do that like once a week, and then I'll go in and it'll be good, and then I won't go back for like a month and a half. And it's like just get stuck in that routine.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's definitely easy to do, and I've done that for long periods of time as well. But just kind of making that effort to get out there and be around some other humans. you know.
right.
Well, Ross, we've talked a lot about things that you and I agree on, but um, one thing that we like to do here is talk about some points of disagreement, which is maybe a interesting place to come from, since you and I coach together. Um,
Right.
so, what would you say is an area where you and I maybe don't see eye to eye, and what are some of your reasons?
Well, I think the length of your beard needs to be longer.
Well, well, you're wrong. So,
There it is.
well, glad we had this talk.
Right. Um, did you lose me? Oh, gotcha. You were hitting mute. I saw the little mute thing. I wasn't sure if that was me.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
But anyway, I suppose when I started thinking about this, the only thing that I could seem to come up with, um, I think that I think there'd be a benefit to having some vertical pulling movement, pull-ups more frequently in the program. Because you've been programming me for about a year and a half now or so, maybe even. And it seems like vertical during deload weeks and or pivot cycles when the loads are reduced and there's not a lot of competition exercises. Um, and I feel especially probably a lot more for novices position. So maybe that's where you had that context was more for me, but I think there'd be more benefit to having more pulling and developing the lats. And so frequently it seems like you see a lot of people having a hard time with scapular retraction and I don't know, and just general lat engagement. It seems like a lot of times people have issues with that. I think that would
So,
help that.
So what I hear you saying is that you tend to favor, um, including more lat work, including more upper back work in the programs than what I would typically put in there. Is that right?
Yeah, especially for the novice lifters.
Okay.
Um,
And
and and not just more frequently, but also having uh, some lower rep, higher intensity work. Not anything, not like a 1RM kind of crazy, silly stuff like that. I mean, you're not gonna benefit much from knowing what your 1RM for pull up is. But I mean, sure, it'd be cool if you knew a pull up with somebody on your back or whatever. But there's not much benefit other than bragging about it. But no, going down as low as 5 reps a set just to get some general strength into there.
okay. And you see the main benefit to that being, um, you mentioned kind of general lat engagement and being able to control scapular retraction and stuff like that. So where do you feel that provides a benefit to your run-of-the-mill average powerlifter?
Definitely going to be a lot more carryover in your stability for your bench and chest position with the bar at your chest, and you're going to have some better flat back position for your deadlift when you get your lats locked down in the proper position.
Okay. For what it's worth, I don't think that you and I are terribly far apart on this, but just by way of exploring the idea a bit more deeply, um, there's kind of uh, a school of thought that frames this problem as, from a standpoint of specificity. That if you needed more lat engagement uh, to provide stability in the bench, then benching would tax that system sufficiently so that there's a strength improvement there, um, allowing basically if that was the limiting factor, then benching would train it. What are your thoughts on that idea?
I don't think it's necessarily completely off, but I don't think that you're going to be able to load those muscle groups in the same fashion, or yeah, just get it generally loaded in the same way to create some strength adaptations for those muscle groups.
So you're kind of saying like it's a viewpoint of like good, better, best. That like, yeah, if your stability was so bad that it was the limiting factor in your bench press, then yeah, bench press would theoretically train it, but it wouldn't be the best way to train it, and it wouldn't get you up to the level that it really needs to be so that it's not a limiting factor anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be the only way that it's trained. Now, obviously, like if you have time constraints where you only have time to bench press, then you gotta bench press, and you're gonna have to avoid that upper back work
Yeah. And
just
for
because
what
of
it's
time.
worth, I think that's kind of where I end up. I am aware that in the programs that I write, there's a little bit, um, oftentimes the lat and upper back work doesn't show up as often as we'd like it to. But the big reason for that, I would say, is that we need to do a certain amount of volume for the bench, the squat, the deadlift, and those closely associated exercises so that we can move the program forward. We can increase the lifter strength. And most of the time, by the time I get that work in the program, we're running into time constraints. There are a few lifters who don't seem to have those constraints, or for whatever reason, we need to place a higher priority on that work. So, say like a history of shoulder issues or something like that, or in Rory's case, she just wanted to include the work, so we made it a priority and we include it. Um, so in those cases, yeah, I would definitely include it a lot more, but it's pretty often that I find myself bumping into those uh, time or practicality constraints. So it does get kind of shunted off to pivot cycles and things like that. Although, I mean, in fairness, if you sum together all the pivot cycles that you do in a year, it's not an insignificant amount of time. It makes up, usually somewhere between 25 and 30% of your training time. So, you know, I don't, I guess I don't really feel like that's a huge absence of vertical pulling work or even horizontal pulling work, because that makes a pretty strong appearance during those pivots as well. So I feel like it would be in there in those cases. And then, of course, if there's a reason to make it a higher priority, then by all means, let's do it. But uh, it would be
So
nice to.
maybe that's another strong point to the new emerging strategies that you've developed. Is that you're right, you do get a bit more of that compared to some of the other strategies that you've used in the past.
Right, right. Definitely, I think so. I think that's definitely the way forward in terms of training development. Which, unfortunately, I haven't been able to put out a ton of information on emerging strategies outside of RTS Classroom,
Right,
but we're working on it. Hopefully,
right.
a bit later this year we'll talk about that in a lot more detail. But yeah, I mean, for sure, I think that you're right. It would be nice to include that a lot more. And there's differences between coaches, and a lot of times the coaches' viewpoints on things are informed by the experiences that they've had. So
Right.
if I tend to work with lifters who you know are
Don't need it.
otherwise healthy, but maybe have some time constraints. And so we end up cutting it out a lot more. That shapes my experience and my views. If you tend to work with lifters, not you specifically, but any coach generally
Right.
tends to work with lifters with shoulder problems, then they're going to place a much higher priority on the lat and upper back work. And I think it just kind of speaks to the importance of context when developing any sort of training program.
Yeah.
So
Do you question on that topic? Do you think, uh, say there isn't necessarily such a high priority on vertical pulling for, especially in regards to a novice lifter? Um, obviously you get your lats loaded isometrically in the deadlift. Um, is that isometric load on a muscle like that really enough?
I think that that's enough for a lot of people for quite a while. Um, it won't be enough forever, but again, at least with how I'm writing programs now, it doesn't have to be. It but you see people a lot of times that train, predominantly squat, bench, and deadlift with very little assistance work, and they do that for years and don't have issues. So I don't think that with any of these things we're working with guarantees. It may be that those people are fortunate, or although I don't think it's so fortunate that it's like winning the lottery or anything. It happens with a bit of regularity. Now maybe some people are less fortunate and can't get away with it for that long. It's just like the round back deadlifting thing, I think,
Right.
that we were talking about before. It's an assumption of some level of risk, and as long as we can assess that somewhat, with some modicum of precision, I think we're okay. And we can make informed decisions based on that assessment. So yeah, I mean, I think that the deadlift is sufficient for quite a while for a lot of people, um, but I don't think it will be forever for hardly anyone. So including something else, even if it's just from a more traditional programming standpoint, even from uh, even just looking at like your off-season work, your restoration cycles and stuff
Right.
like that, that's the time to include more lat and upper back work. And it's also the time to include movement in other planes. It's a time to include ab work and rotational work, and things that you don't otherwise have time or energy to do.
Right. Right. Yeah, because I guess one of my thoughts on that was that just for general muscular development and general health of those muscles that get loaded in a vertical pull, is that they're going to benefit from having a full range of motion load with concentric and eccentric phases, and not just isometric stuck in one position. That's all you get.
Yeah, I mean, I do see a benefit. I think full range of motion a lot of times is a bit arbitrary, but I do see a benefit to having a greater range of motion for sure. And the difference in range of motion between, um, say a deadlift and a pull up is pretty
Right.
dramatic. So,
Right.
uh, yeah, I mean, I do definitely think that it's beneficial. It's always just kind of a question of how beneficial and how do you prioritize these things in real life context. To me,
Right. And it's probably one of those things that you don't really have an ability to measure it. You don't really have an ability to, I guess there's not really a dire need to know the answer to that question. It's more just
well,
what you think and
I
what you
do think
like.
it's an interesting question, right? It's a very interesting question. So, I mean, what are the consequences that we're looking at? I mean, on one end, we've been talking about the potential for injury, potential for shoulder injuries, for example, in this case. So it would be interesting to look at that and to see, if we include like lifters that include lat and upper back work in their training, do they actually experience a lower incidence of shoulder injuries compared to people that don't include those things? I mean, I don't know. I hear from people who I trust that that is true, but I'm not exactly sure how they know it either. Uh, it could be that this is a thing that's well investigated and I'm just not aware of it. But it's also possible that it hasn't been looked at very thoroughly.
Right. But I guess my point is on that is that the only way to attempt to answer that question that I see is by doing a survey and asking people those questions along those lines to help answer that question. Um, and I think there's going to be a lot of inaccuracies in that type of data if you just ask a bunch of people questions like that and do a poll, as compared to
Yeah.
like what you do with Project Momentum, where you do a study, and it's a bit more, I guess, scientific, for lack of a better word. I know there's probably some more controls that you'd like to be able to have in place that could clarify some of the data, but
Yeah.
I don't think you could do a study for something like that. Hey, I want to see if you guys get injured, and I want to see if you guys stay healthy. Who wants to sign up?
Right. Right. Yeah. I don't.
I don't think you're going to have a very large data sample for something like
No.
that.
No. And there's some not insignificant ethical issues with that as well. But
Yeah. Oh,
one
absolutely.
other way to do it would be through a training log analysis. If you had reliable training log data from a wide range of people over a
Right.
sufficient span of time, and also there was a way for them to reliably indicate incidences of injury. I suppose that could be done more reliably with a survey. Like if you've had a shoulder injury to the point where you needed to go to the doctor or needed to go to see a physical therapist, it, and um, your ability to misremember that is going to be a bit less, compared to, how much, how often do you do lat and upper back work? So, maybe kind of a combination between, training log analysis and a survey would be fruitful for answering that question. But I mean, then again, maybe that's a thing that's already been done and we're just not aware of it. Um, it also turns out that's a good reason for people to use the RTS training log app. So, so there's
Yep.
that.
That there is.
Yeah. Well, Ross, I think we definitely are running a bit short on time here, and I want to just thank you
Okay.
for being generous with your time
Yeah.
today.
It's been
Um,
fun.
yeah, yeah, definitely, and it was a good conversation. I'm glad that you brought up what you have. Um, for anybody listening, I hope you enjoyed our discussion. And Ross, for people that want to connect with you, social media wise, or any other way, basically, how would they go about doing that?
On Instagram, you can find me with Ross_RTS. Facebook's just my name, and if you wanted to shoot me an email and chat anytime, it's ross@reactivetrainingsystems.com.
Yeah, yeah. And if you want to work with Ross or anything like that, you can send Ross an email or contact me in any of the many ways that you can do that. I'm on Instagram as Mike Touchier, on Facebook as Mike Touchier, basically anywhere that you would care to connect with me as Mike Touchier, or through Reactive Training Systems, through the contact page on reactivetrainingsystems.com and so on. If you'd like to connect with us, have more in-depth conversations about any of this, or just generally have feedback on the podcast and things that you'd like to see or hear in the future, please let me know. We'd love to hear from you. With that, that's all we've got for this episode. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys next time.
Reactive Training Systems.